In 1789, 25 men seized control of a British naval vessel in the middle of the South Pacific. They dragged their captain from his cabin, forced him into a small open boat with 18 loyalists, and set him adrift with minimal supplies in the open ocean. The mutiny aboard HMS Bounty became one of the most famous events in naval history. Books were written about it. Hollywood made it into 3 separate films. But almost nobody remembers why the ship was there in the first place. It wasn't carrying soldiers. It wasn't carrying cargo. It was carrying plants. Over 1,000 potted breadfruit trees, carefully collected from Tahiti under orders from King George III. The mission was simple and brutal. Transport the trees to the Caribbean. Feed the enslaved workforce as cheaply as possible so plantation owners could maximize profit. Captain William Bligh wasn't a naval hero. He was a delivery driver for a crop so productive that a single tree could feed a family for 50 years without replanting, without fertilizer, and without irrigation. A tree so valuable that an empire launched a naval expedition to steal it, and then the world forgot it existed. The story begins not in England but in the forests of New Guinea, roughly 3,500 years ago. A people archaeologists call the Lapita were preparing for the most ambitious migration in human history. They loaded double-hulled canoes with everything needed to build civilization from nothing: pigs, chickens, taro, yams, and the seedlings of a tall, broad-leaf tree that bore round, starchy fruit the size of a man's head. They called it ulu. It was breadfruit, Artocarpus altilis. The Lapita sailed west to east across the largest ocean on Earth, settling island after island, from Melanesia to Fiji to Tonga to Samoa. Everywhere they landed, they planted ulu first. The tree grew fast. It fruited within 3 to 5 years. A single mature tree produced 200 fruits per season, each weighing 1 to 6 kilograms. Once established, it produced for 50 years or more without replanting. Breadfruit was not one crop among many, it was the foundation. And in 2022, a study published in PLOS Climate would calculate just how much of the Earth's surface could still grow it. But the people who needed that data most had already been taught the tree was worthless. Across Polynesia, entire civilizations were engineered around this single species. On the island of Pohnpei in Micronesia, traditional agroforestry systems placed breadfruit as the primary canopy tree, shading understory crops of taro, banana, and yam. The system required no tilling, no clearing, no chemical input. It was a self-sustaining food forest that fed communities for centuries. In Hawaii, breadfruit plantations were so vast that historians believe they fed over 75,000 people. When British surgeon Archibald Menzies visited the Kona coast in 1793, he walked through groves so dense the trees blocked out the sky. The Hawaiians did not farm breadfruit, they inherited it. Polynesians developed more than 2,000 named varieties, some for eating raw, some for roasting over open flame, some for drying into flour that could be stored for months. And one preservation method was so effective it defied modern understanding. Islanders buried peeled breadfruit in leaf-lined pits, where it fermented into a thick, sour paste. Some pits have produced edible contents more than 20 years after burial. No refrigeration, no chemicals, no loss. This was the food system European sailors discovered when they arrived in the Pacific. In 1769, botanist Joseph Banks sailed with Captain James Cook aboard the HMS Endeavour. Banks spent 3 months in Tahiti. He watched Tahitians eat breadfruit at nearly every meal. He watched them bake it, boil it, roast it, ferment it. He watched children climb trees and drop fruit that would feed an entire family. Banks calculated what the plantation owners of Jamaica and Barbados had been demanding for decades. A single breadfruit tree, once planted, required no annual seed purchase, no plowing, no irrigation, no fertilizer. It produced more calories per acre than wheat, rice, or potatoes, and it kept producing for half a century. The British sugar plantations of the Caribbean ran on enslaved labor. Feeding that labor force cost money. Importing food from North America was expensive and unreliable. If breadfruit could be transplanted to the Caribbean, plantation owners could feed their enslaved workers for almost nothing, forever. Banks brought the idea to King George III. The king commissioned a naval expedition. The mission was not scientific, it was economic. Steal a crop from the Pacific, plant it in the Caribbean, reduce the cost of slavery. In December 1787, HMS Bounty departed England under the command of Lieutenant William Bligh. The ship had been specifically refitted for the mission. The great cabin, normally reserved for the captain, was converted into a floating greenhouse. Over 1,000 breadfruit saplings were to be collected from Tahiti and transported alive across 27,000 miles of ocean. Bligh reached Tahiti in October 1788. For 5 months, he and his crew collected 1,015 breadfruit plants, carefully potting each one. The crew lived among Tahitians. They formed relationships. They tasted a life without the brutality of naval discipline. On April 28, 1789, 3 weeks after departing Tahiti, Fletcher Christian led 25 men in seizing the ship. They set Bligh and 18 loyalists adrift in a 23-foot open launch with minimal food and water. Bligh navigated 3,618 nautical miles to Timor in 47 days, one of the most remarkable feats of seamanship in history. The 1,015 breadfruit trees were thrown overboard. Hollywood told the story as a tale of tyranny and rebellion. 3 films, endless myth. But the mutiny buried the real question. Why was an empire willing to spend a fortune transporting a tree? Most people do not know that Bligh went back. In 1791, the Admiralty commissioned him again aboard HMS Providence with an escort vessel, HMS Assistant. This time, there was no mutiny. Bligh collected 2,126 breadfruit plants from Tahiti and delivered them to St. Vincent and Jamaica in 1793. The plants survived. They were distributed to plantations across the Caribbean. The mission that launched the most famous mutiny in history was, in the end, completed. But something unexpected happened. The enslaved people refused to eat it. They had established their own food systems based on plantains, yams, and cassava. Breadfruit was foreign. It was bland when prepared without the Polynesian techniques that made it palatable. The plantation owners' scheme to reduce feeding costs failed. Breadfruit trees grew across the Caribbean, fruiting abundantly, and almost nobody harvested them. The irony is precise. A tree that had sustained Pacific civilizations for 3,000 years was rejected not because it lacked value, but because the people forced to eat it had never been taught how to prepare it. Knowledge was erased in transit. Here is what the British Empire knew, but the modern world has forgotten. Breadfruit produces 103 calories per 100 grams of raw fruit. That is higher than potatoes, taro, and plantain. It delivers 25% of the recommended daily fiber in a single 100-gram serving, along with significant amounts of potassium at 490 milligrams, vitamin C at 29 milligrams, phosphorus, magnesium, thiamine, and niacin. But the real revelation came in laboratory analysis. Breadfruit contains all essential amino acids. The Ma'afala variety tested at over 568 milligrams of amino acid content per gram of protein, a higher concentration of essential amino acids than soybeans. Double the amino acid load of potatoes per serving. This is a complete protein source growing on a tree. No livestock required. Breadfruit flour has a lower glycemic index than both wheat and rice flour. The high dietary fiber and amylose content slow glucose absorption, making it beneficial for diabetic populations. Fermented breadfruit produces both prebiotics and probiotics in a single bite, a complete gut health system growing on a branch. It is naturally gluten-free, 3 times the fiber of brown rice, 12 times the fiber of white rice. They buried the fiber. They erased the flour. But they also made you forget that a tree could replace your grocery store. Pick up a ripe breadfruit and the skin gives slightly under your thumb, yellow-green and warm from the sun. Split it open and the flesh is pale, dense, faintly sweet. Roast it over an open flame and the outside chars, while the inside softens into something that tastes like fresh bread crossed with a baked potato. The name was never a metaphor. It was a description. A single breadfruit tree produces up to 200 fruits per season. At an average weight of 1 to 3 kilograms per fruit, that is 200 to 600 kilograms of food from one tree per year. For 50 years, no replanting, no tilling, no annual seed purchase, no irrigation once established, no pesticide. The tree's deep root system accesses water that shallow-rooted annual crops cannot reach. It withstands 3 to 4 months of drought. It sequesters carbon dioxide from the atmosphere throughout its lifespan. A breadfruit grove is not just food production, it is a carbon sink. Compare this to wheat. Wheat must be planted, fertilized, irrigated, harvested, and replanted every single year. Global wheat production consumes billions of liters of water and millions of tons of synthetic fertilizer annually. Rice requires flooded paddies that produce methane, a greenhouse gas 80 times more potent than CO2 over 20 years. Corn is the most chemically intensive crop on the planet. Breadfruit asks for sunlight and rain. It produces for half a century. And the global seed, fertilizer, and pesticide industries generate over $300 billion in combined annual revenue by selling products that breadfruit renders unnecessary. You cannot sell annual inputs to a tree that lives for 50 years. Walk through a mature breadfruit grove in Samoa, and the canopy shuts out the sun. The trunks rise 20 meters, smooth and pale, branching into broad crowns that interlock overhead. Green fruit the size of footballs hang in clusters from every branch. The ground beneath is littered with fallen fruit that nobody needs because there is already too much. In 2020, a team at the University of Hawaii, led by Noah Lincoln, published a study in PLOS One using 17 global climate models to project breadfruit cultivation potential through 2070. They calibrated the model using over 1,200 naturalized breadfruit trees in Hawaii. The result? Under every climate scenario tested, breadfruit suitability either held steady or increased. 2 years later, in 2022, Northwestern University researchers Lucy Yang and Daniel Horton published a follow-up in PLOS Climate. They modeled breadfruit viability between 2061 and 2080 under both high-emission and stabilization scenarios. The suitable land area for breadfruit decreased by only 4.4 to 4.5%. For comparison, projections for wheat, rice, corn, and soybeans show significant yield declines in those same tropical regions. The Northwestern team found something else. A vast swath of sub-Saharan Africa, where 240 million people face chronic food insecurity, already has the climate conditions to grow breadfruit. The tree has simply never been broadly introduced there. Nairi Zarega, the study's co-author and director of the program in plant biology and conservation at Northwestern, said the quiet part aloud. In some cultures, there is a tradition to plant a breadfruit tree when a child is born to ensure the child will have food for the rest of their life. A tree planted at birth that feeds you until you die, and nobody is funding its distribution. Drive through rural Jamaica today and you will see them. Massive breadfruit trees lining roadsides and standing in abandoned lots. Fruit falling to the ground and rotting because nobody picks it up. Captain Bligh's 2,126 saplings survived. They multiplied. The Caribbean has breadfruit growing everywhere. But for nearly 2 centuries, the tree carried the stigma of slavery. It was the food the masters chose for the enslaved. Eating it felt like submission. The psychological damage was deliberate. When a food is associated with captivity, the population that was captive rejects it after liberation. Breadfruit in the Caribbean became slave food, a phrase that persisted for generations. Children were taught to aspire toward imported wheat flour, white rice, canned goods from America. The colonial diet replaced the colonial crop. Today, the Caribbean imports over $5 billion worth of food annually. The region suffers from epidemic rates of diabetes, obesity, and diet-related disease. The tree that produces complete protein, low glycemic starch, prebiotic fiber, and essential vitamins stands in their yards untouched. What was planted as a tool of oppression became a symbol of it, and the symbol outlasted the reality. In 2003, Dr. Diane Ragone founded the Breadfruit Institute at the National Tropical Botanical Garden in Hawaii. She had spent decades collecting breadfruit varieties from across the Pacific, assembling the largest living collection in the world. Over 120 varieties from 34 island groups, planted in rows along a hillside on Kauai, each tree tagged, measured, and documented. A quiet living library holding 3,000 years of Polynesian agricultural knowledge in its root systems. Ragone's mission was not academic. She understood the math. 80% of the world's hungry live in the tropics. Breadfruit grows in the tropics. The tree is already adapted to the regions where food insecurity is worst. It does not need to be engineered. It does not need genetic modification. It does not need laboratory development. It needs to be planted. The Trees That Feed Foundation, working alongside Ragone's Institute, has distributed over 200,000 breadfruit trees across Haiti, Jamaica, and other Caribbean and Pacific nations. In Tamasek, Haiti, a farmer named Jean Rabel Augustin received his first breadfruit saplings in 2016. Within 4 years, his 3 trees were producing over 400 fruits per season. He told the foundation's field team that for the first time in his life, he had more food than his family could eat. He began sharing fruit with his neighbors. By 2021, a case study published in the Journal of Global Health Reports confirmed that breadfruit provides high levels of essential nutrients and can address both malnutrition and food insecurity in rural communities. But the neglect runs deeper than bureaucratic delay. The pattern is precise. A perennial food source that eliminates annual dependency gets ignored, defunded, or erased. You have seen it with every crop that threatens the supply chain. Breadfruit cannot be patented. Its varieties have been in cultivation for 3,000 years. It is public domain. You cannot sell fertilizer to a tree that fertilizes itself through leaf litter decomposition. You cannot sell pesticide to a species that is naturally disease-resistant. You cannot sell irrigation equipment to a root system that reaches deep water tables. You cannot sell annual seed to a tree that lives for half a century. The global agricultural input market generates hundreds of billions of dollars per year by maintaining dependency on annual crops that require constant purchased inputs. Breadfruit disrupts that entire model. Not theoretically, actually. One tree, one planting, 50 years of food. And the international body that should be promoting it, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, did not publish guidelines for breadfruit propagation until 2011. 3,000 years after Polynesian navigators spread it across the Pacific, the FAO got around to writing a pamphlet. Every breadfruit tree in the Caribbean is a descendant of Bly's cargo. The trees he delivered in 1793 have been reproducing for over 230 years. They survived hurricanes. They survived colonialism. They survived being called slave food. They kept fruiting. In some Pacific cultures, breadfruit trees are considered family members. When a child is born, a tree is planted. The child grows. The tree grows. By the time the child reaches adulthood, the tree is producing 200 fruits per year. By the time the child has children of their own, the tree is still feeding them. One planting. No contract with a seed company. No annual purchase order. No dependency on a supply chain controlled by corporations on another continent. The tree is the supply chain. It is the factory. It is the warehouse. It is the distribution network. And it asks for nothing in return. The 2022 Northwestern study identified that breadfruit could expand across sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Central America, and South America, regions where climate change threatens existing staple crops most severely. Because most cultivated varieties are seedless, Breadfruit has little to no risk of becoming invasive in new environments. In 2019, the Samoan government launched a national breadfruit replanting initiative, distributing improved varieties to rural communities across Upolu and Savaii. Early results showed household food expenditure dropping by up to 30% within 3 years of tree maturity. Samoa was not innovating, it was remembering. The same varieties the Lapita carried in their canoes 3,000 years ago were being returned to the villages that had let them decline. The math is straightforward. Plant 100 breadfruit trees, wait 3 to 5 years, begin harvesting up to 20,000 fruits per year from those 100 trees. Continue harvesting for 50 years. No replanting, no purchased inputs. The flower can be dried and stored, extending shelf life for global distribution. The fresh fruit can be steamed, roasted, fried, or fermented. Breadfruit is not a theoretical solution. It is a 3,000-year-old proven system that feeds billions of calories per year across 90 countries today. It simply has never received the institutional support, the research funding, or the political attention given to the crops that generate corporate revenue. Every breadfruit tree planted today is an act of defiance against a food system designed for dependency. The varieties exist. Dr. Ragon's collection at the National Tropical Botanical Garden holds the genetic library of 3,000 years of Polynesian agricultural knowledge. The Trees That Feed Foundation ships saplings to communities across the tropics. The science is settled. The climate projections confirm the tree thrives where other crops will fail. The nutrition data confirms it outperforms most staple foods on multiple dimensions. What it lacks is not evidence. What it lacks is profit motive. And that absence of profit motive is precisely why it has been neglected for 200 years. A crop that cannot generate recurring revenue will never receive the institutional support of one that can. That is not conspiracy, that is economics. And it is the reason a tree that could feed millions sits in backyards across the Caribbean, dropping fruit onto the ground. The story of breadfruit is not about a tree. It is about what happens when food cannot be controlled. For 3,000 years, Polynesian navigators carried breadfruit seedlings across the widest ocean on Earth, planting them on every island they reached. They understood something that industrial agriculture has spent 2 centuries trying to make you forget. Food does not have to be purchased. It does not have to be manufactured. It does not have to arrive on a ship or a truck or a freight train. It can grow outside your door, year after year, generation after generation, asking for nothing. An empire launched a mutiny-plagued naval expedition to steal this knowledge. Then the world forgot why the ship was there. But the trees never forgot what they were made to do. In 1789, 1,000 breadfruit saplings were thrown into the Pacific Ocean during the most famous mutiny in history. In 1793, 2,000 more were delivered to the Caribbean and left to rot. In 2022, scientists confirm the tree will outlast climate change itself. And still, almost nobody knows its name. But now you do. If this vault opens something for you, subscribe to Nature Unearthed and hit the bell. Every like and every share preserves what they tried to erase. The next vault opens soon.